Hey folks, this is Mark Lander, Scrum Master.
And this is Mackenzie Ginth, another Scrum Master. So, Mark, what are we talking about today?
Today we're going to be talking about sprint planning and the pitfalls associated with it.
Ooh, man. It's actually kind of funny. When I was getting started with this, I was like, oh, there's not that many pitfalls to sprint planning. It's a pretty straightforward, event. And then I started listing out all the pitfalls that I've experienced and like literally just had a page full of pitfalls. And I just couldn't believe how many ways that this event can give teams problems, right? But Mark, what is the top problem that we identified for teams and sprint planning?
Easily the top problem is that we take too much time to do it, that the meeting either runs long or it doesn't get fully completed within the time allotted. And the reason for that really is, of all the Scrum events, planning requires the most pre-work.
Mm,
It requires the most context setting, because without that context, with the team being familiar with what you're going to plan, that's where the excessive duration and all these different activities really stems from. Because if you approach it from like a flow standpoint, you can accomplish most of the activities required to complete planning outside of a meeting. And if you can manage to do that through the duration of an iteration and be ready for that next one, you can just walk right in and knock it out.
yeah, and that's a good point. It kind of usually you see that play out with like newer teams, which is exactly what you're talking about. Newer teams, they don't have that context setting. There's a lot that they're working through, and it's like their plannings turn into like refinement slash problem solving slash ways of working, team norms, and it's like this overloaded event that just goes on for like hours and hours if you let it. And then there's teams that have been together for like stable work processes, stable development processes. The product hasn't really changed. They're kind of just making updates. And their sprint planning is like, yeah, 10, 15 minutes. It's kind of
Right.
a joke. And I'm always like a little jealous when people say that, oh yeah, my sprint plan took 15 minutes. I'm like, oh man, like so jealous, right? Uh, but yeah, so how do you kind of address that? Maybe newer teams dealing with a lot of stuff. Like how do
Well,
you
newer teams, the concept of something like Sprint Zero, that exists entirely because you're acknowledging, hey, we have to set this context, do this. So that involves getting the team familiar with the work, making sure they understand the product vision, and how do you break that down into kind of smaller steps enough to like, okay, do we understand this well enough to get going? Okay, now we can plan.
Oh, Sprint Zero. All right. I think there might be some people that are triggered by that or disagree with you. That's fine. um, yeah, and really like it goes to show that like a lot of work does need to happen beforehand in the product backlog. A lot of refinement with the product owners, that context setting just needs to happen beforehand. And ideally you come in with work items, whether they're stories, tasks, bugs, whatever, work items that are really well fleshed out. And there's not a discussion of what this thing is, it's more of a discussion. Does this make sense to pick up in the sprint, right?
Right.
Does it make sense to pick up? And also, what is our rough plan to accomplish it? We're not trying to like, you know, come up with like the perfect plan, very detailed, what day someone's going to do what and talk to this person. It's like, do we have a sense of like what it's going to take to get this done? All right, cool. Let's move on, right? That's kind of what we're looking for.
Yeah, someone once told me that a user story really represents a conversation, and that conversation really does have to take place before planning. It's asking all those questions, poking holes into, do you understand what's really being asked for? Do we know how to deliver? Do we have acceptance criteria that we know that we've delivered what was asked for? And yeah, it's less about the details of how you get there. It's just, have we answered enough of these questions that the team as a whole has a good sense of how to move forward?
Yep, exactly. So maybe that's some things to think about before the meeting, right? Now, Mark, we've been there before. We just got out of a sprint planning that this happened. You're a scrum master, you're into sprint planning and you think it's going to go long or it is going long. What do you do? Like, how do you handle that sprint planning that's just like going on and on and on, and you need to make it work somehow? So, what are some options that a scrum master could do?
Oh man, for me, I guess that comes back to establishing that overall priority, because if you're having trouble like distilling this down and breaking it off into a discrete sprint plan, it's like, okay, start from the top. What's most important? Do we know enough to get that done? How do we, if the conversation is running too long and we're tackling too many things, let's narrow the focus onto the most important things and take things one step at a time.
Yep, yep, exactly. And sometimes I'll get to a point where maybe I'll extend the sprint planning event a little bit longer. Maybe I'll set up like like um, another sprint planning session later in the day or the next day. But sometimes I'm like, listen, like I might do that like one or two times, but after that, it's like, listen, like we can plan all day long. We just need to get started. And so it kind of goes back to what you said. It's like, do we know enough to get like the next few days done? Cool. Let's start there, kick everything out, and let's make a plan for how we're going to address the work after those first few days, right? Like you're not going to be perfect. Just get started.
And that's a really good point, because yeah, you have those two options of, if the team is really swirling that much, then you have to let go of that notion that you're going to fully plan out the sprint. Like if
Yeah.
there's that much unknowns, then just strip it down to, okay, we'll undercommit, we'll establish priority, establish next steps, and we can pull work in as needed after that.
That's the magic line I always use. We can always pull work in, always pull work in, and it kind of gives the people hopefully like a warm and fuzzy of when I do like look to push stuff out. It's like no, like we can always pull it back in, but let's just set our focus for the next few days, maybe the first week, and then just get started. Cool. All right. I feel like that's enough on the top pitfall. Mark, what's that next one that we identified for
Yeah,
pitfalls that teams run into?
for me, the next major pitfall is not having established a clearly prioritized backlog.
Hmm.
Like
Okay.
in some sense, you want this process to be automatic. And for that to work, there has to be that top-down, force-ranked priority of items that the team can just go one by one. Here's how we move things forward. Because back to those earlier points, if you're tackling an unprioritized list, it can feel like boiling the ocean, and it's easy to get lost in
Oh,
the wrong areas.
yeah, that's a good point. It kind of goes back to taking too long because, I mean, imagine you bring in the backlog, right? And you're like, all right, well, I guess we'll just start from top to bottom. And then you start covering work items, and then you're spending time talking about work items or diving into the details. You're like fleshing out that work. And then it's like someone says, wait, isn't like updating the database more important than that work? And you're like, why? We just spent like 5, 10 minutes talking about this thing, and who cares? Like, who cares? Just like putting the backlog. You're right. It really is important to kind of prioritize that work to make sure you're talking about the most important thing. Otherwise, it's just like a waste, right?
Yeah, over planning is something that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it's so common and easy to happen, right? It rather than spend that time planning for stuff that may be beyond the sprint, or may just be so far down the line that could change by the time you get to it. Like you really got to strip that down to, let's stick to the top priorities, limit the work in progress,
Yeah.
because things are going to change as we go anyway.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to that over planning is I think it kind of feels good, right? It feels like you're working, it feels like you're busy, it feels like you're making progress, but you're not. You're not making progress. You're just talking about the work instead of doing the work, right?
Plus, it's
So,
just like human nature, right? It's like a security blanket. It makes us feel good if we can
yeah,
map this out and say, okay,
yeah,
here's the plan, here's what we're going to follow. But we know in software development that it's never going to stick to that straight line path.
yeah, yeah. And if it does, I guess you're working in a great environment and you're kind of lucky. But yeah, so how do you kind of coach a team for that as far as you're recognizing that maybe we're not working on the most important thing. You're switching context in the sprint planning. Like, how do you coach for that beforehand? Like, what are you working on?
Yeah, that goes back to the pre-work. I mean, step one, working with the product owner to make sure that they understand how important it is for the team to have that automatic pull from the
Mhm.
top response. Like that's super critical. And one area to help with that is don't have too large of a backlog, right? Prioritization gets hard if you've got like 200 items in it, but it's like keep it down to what we know we're going to get to in the short run. We can always add stuff later. So you kind of narrow that focus of the conversation there.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of reminded of something that you mentioned every once in a while, which is like, hey, what's that top thing that you're most excited to work on? And like kind of use that as a starting point because you're right. It's like, no, it's like just ignore the backlog for a second, right? Just a second. Just talk to me. What do you think is the most important thing we could deliver this next sprint? Or like, what are you most excited about for this team in the short run? All right, cool. And it's like, well, how does our backlog fit into that? And then you can kind of like segue into the backlog based on that conversation you just had.
Yeah,
Um,
I totally agree with that. Like in all the settings of Scrum and Agile, it's like if you're having trouble having these conversations, strip it down to one thing. Like even when it comes to like establishing velocity, if you don't have a velocity, cool. Let's just focus on one thing and then move on from there.
yeah, yeah, exactly. What about you're in the meeting, you're a scrum master, and you're noticing that like, wait, are we working on the right thing? Like, how do you deal with that? Do you just say that and then hopefully the team pivots, or is there something you do with that, Mark?
Yeah, I
Where
mean,
do you
I
go with
think
it?
that's a tricky one because it's going to depend on the team kind of helping you out to navigate that because we as Scrum Masters are not in the weeds like they are. So we can kind of be observant for when that's happening, but the team has to also speak to, hey, is this the right level of conversation? Especially when it comes to discussing the what versus the how. Like
Mhm.
when it comes to Scrum, product owners own the what. Tell us what is going to be delivered. The team owns the how. And when it comes to this planning conversation, it's like we don't have to plan out exactly how this is going
Right.
to get done. We just need to establish what's going to get done. The how is part of the process.
Yeah.
And that can be a struggle for newer teams, but
Oh, yeah.
for mature teams, that just needs to be baked into your process.
That reminds me of one of the pitfalls that I called out that we probably won't get to, but I have to call it out now, which is I worked with a team where the product owner not only described the how, but also the what.
Oh,
They bring in tasks and user stories, and they pretty much give the plan to the team. And I was just like, oh man, this is not going to go well. And it did. But yeah, you're right. It's like, hey, is this the most important thing we can work on? How to shift that focus to those conversations. Cool. I think we can move on to the next one. Ooh, this is, I think, like if you've been a Scrum Master for, I don't know, 2 sprints, you probably run into this, which is the team overcommitting within a sprint. This is just so normal for every team,
right.
right? They take on way too much. They want to boil the ocean. And I'm always there kind of pulling them back and reining them in a little bit. So, Mark, talk to me about this one.
Yeah. Some good intentions, right? It's a lot of times it's just excitement. We want to get this work done. We want to demonstrate value, and so it's easy to have that tendency to take off more than you can chew. But then it comes back to, are we over planning, right?
Mm,
So the best advice I try to give is let's keep this as close as possible to yesterday's weather. There's no reason to reach too far beyond what you've already proven you can do. Like if your velocity is 12, you probably don't want to go much higher than 15. Or I've even seen some teams say you should never go higher than what you've not previously demonstrated you can achieve.
And just for clarification, what is yesterday's weather?
Oh, that's just tying your velocity, your commitment to, and understanding your capacity to let's compare this with evidence-based fact of this is what we have done in the past. This is what we have proven we can do. So we won't go beyond what we've proven we can do.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, someone's explained to me, I think pretty, the best estimate of tomorrow's weather was yesterday's weather.
Exactly.
And so that's kind of like the notion here. It's like, well, hey, how many points are we going to complete next sprint? I don't know. Well, last sprint we did, 50. Cool. Well, let's just kind of use that as a baseline and go from there.
Right.
And yeah, I've had so many conversations with teams where it's like, all right, you planned, 80. We've never done 80 points
Right.
ever in the sprints. And it's like, does that make sense? Like, what am I missing, right? But there's also the flip side of that as a Scrum Master, where it's like, hey, I'm not going to just take these numbers as truth. It's like there's a story that I'm not understanding, right? So tell me that story. Like maybe like they just like refactor the code and it's gonna go way faster. Maybe the testers just like got an
Yeah.
automation test suite that's gonna automate their testing processes. I don't know. So it's like just having those conversations is very important.
Yeah, and we mentioned this before. For me, this comes back to the over planning and just reinforcing with the team. It's okay to undercommit and pull work in. It's actually leaner to do it that way to instead of over plan. Just plan what you need to. It's a good thing to pull work in as needed.
Cool. And I've got a train coming in the background. So Mark, can you just end this video recording pretty soon, or just wrap it up?
Yeah. So I think we covered all the main talking points we wanted to get to. Planning again is one of the meetings that's most prone to improving by getting ahead of it before the meeting. And the major sign that you're having struggles with completing the meeting on time is going to come back to those conversations. Are they happening outside the meeting? Are they happening inside the meeting? What are the things you can work on as a team to kind of streamline that whole process and kind of think of planning continuously? How do we do that?
I like that. Planning continuously. I like that a lot. That's nice. That's a great way to end it. So yeah, thanks for stopping by and watching the video. And yeah, we'll come at you with more pitfalls of Scrum. Thanks.
Thanks.